This is part 2 of the episode that I recorded with Carolyn. And we had such a great conversation in our first episode that I had come up with some new questions that I wanted to ask her and asked if she would come on again with me. And I had only had 2 questions, but then when we got recording, we ended up recording a session that I decided was long enough to turn into part 2. So this is part 2. It isn't as formal as my podcasts normally are because I was just going to insert this into our original recording, but instead decided to do a part 2. There isn't really a formal introduction in this episode, but again, I am interviewing Carolyn, and we are talking about tangible things that you can do to help process your emotions. Empowered, mind, body, soul. A podcast journey to your truth with heartfelt stories, sound healing, and life hacks. So you've mentioned that sometimes we have these stories that we tell, and I've heard this in the spiritual community as well, about that's a story you're telling yourself, create a new story. Sometimes I feel a little attacked by that or gaslit by that because I feel like, but this is what's happening in my life currently, and I don't really understand how I'm supposed to just change that story. At least in the spiritual community, always what I hear is, speak as if it's already happened. And I just have a really hard time with that. Like, how am I acknowledging where I'm at in my journey, whether it has to do with spiritual concepts or even, let's say, it's my financial situation or a love situation or whatever? How am I changing that story without feeling like I'm lying to myself?
I think that's a great question. And it's interesting because the mind gives meaning to every sort of experience that we have. And so a lot of times an experience that we have is an experience. There's this neutrality to it, but our mind gives it some sort of meaning and creates a story about what it is that we're experiencing. And that's where it can be interesting to think, okay, what are you telling yourself about a particular circumstance? And then you can ask yourself, is there another possible way to be able to look at this? I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe one might be if you, I don't know, say you're at work, for example, and you walk by your boss and they don't acknowledge you. So one story could be, see, I knew that they don't like me. I know that I'm not doing well enough. I might just end up getting fired, right? And so this can be one story. Or another story might be like, gosh, it seems like she might have a lot on her mind. It seems like she's like really focusing on something. I hope like her day gets better as she goes throughout the day. And that might be just like a general example to be able to share. But I think it can be interesting just to almost unpack just different stories that we tell ourselves about our experiences and examining what are we telling ourselves? Is it coming from maybe a space of lack or from one of our wounds? And is there a different way to reframe it? That could also be true and could also feel more empowering at the same time.
Okay, so how would I change my story? Let's talk about like abundance and finances. So let's say I feel like, I have a certain amount of abundance flowing to me. There's only so much I can do with that abundance. And so I feel limited, like I can't do X, Y, and Z because I don't have the financial means to be able to do X, Y, and Z. So how would I change that story into something that's more empowering or helps shift that energy?
I think looking at that piece, there's this piece of, I'm only have a limited amount of abundance to do what I want to do. And so it can be just checking in about, okay, is that a story that you might keep repeating to yourself? And a way to be able to switch it could be just like looking for those little glimpses of abundance that come into your life that you might be overlooking. And as you notice some of these things, even telling yourself, like, hey, this is like another step towards increasing my abundance, or another step to being able to change my situation. The universe is responding to my vibration and this change that I'm having within myself. And look at this. This is for me. This is so exciting. And so, where it can be easy to overlook
Okay.
some of that stuff, but I think it's almost like looking for an opportunity or a possibility and things that are happening rather than being fixated on maybe the certain circumstances that are happening and feeling as though they just aren't changing.
I see. So shifting kind of your focus.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say
Okay.
shifting your
All
focus
right.
and asking yourself what you're telling yourself about that, then that is something that helps start to shift the story and create a new story for yourself. Or maybe it becomes like, hey, unexpected
Okay.
abundance finds me all the time. How amazing is this? Even if it might at the beginning feel like it's little pieces of abundance. But seeing if that helps kind of like
Okay.
build the
Okay.
momentum. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that explanation, and I appreciate learning how I can change my perspective in a way that helps me to feel more empowered.
Good.
It's been my experience working with spiritual healers, and this is something I've even said myself and probably said without fully understanding, that we have to heal our wounds and we have to get to that root cause or that root situation. And then the next step is to process that situation or process our emotions. But I'm still a little confused about how do you process those emotions so you can have some forward progression in your healing
Mhm.
journey.
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. Because I'll even hear from a lot of people like, gosh, I feel like I still feel my feelings and I still might cry about things, but it seems like things just aren't changing. And so, what I feel it is kind of like going within and really being present with that inner part of yourself that's hurting. Can almost feel like you're like entering a cave is almost how I would look at it. Like this wound is in this cave in your subconscious self, and you're just kind of like peeking in there to be like, hey, I'm curious about you. I want to feel you. I want to get to know you. And as you are allowing yourself to be present with the emotion, you're probably going to begin to feel it rather strongly. Sometimes it can be a part that maybe brings up a lot of feelings of anxiety, or maybe you do start to feel just really overwhelmed with sadness. And I think that's where it's going to be important to stay with the emotion during that time rather than pulling back from it. And then I always like to think that we can work with our emotions as though that they are parts of us and even personifying them. And so maybe even asking the wounds and the emotion, what do you need? What do you need to feel loved? What do you need to feel healed? What is something that you're needing that has been missing? And then you can even imagine yourself just bringing in the energy of love to this space. And it can be this feeling. Maybe it's kind of like this white light, for example, that you're bringing in to help encircle and engulf the wounds. Whatever it might be for you. I almost like to think, just kind of like let your inner self guide the process. And then as you're doing this, you're not only just feeling the emotion, but you're healing it at the same time because you're bringing in this higher vibrational energy to be present with the wounds. And then that tends to start the transformation process. With it, I think you'll feel a difference as it starts to happen. I think you'll feel this internal shift. And it doesn't mean the wound is not ever going to be reactivated again. And I think that's an important part with the healing process. And so it's something that does continue to take time and consistency with it. But I think a big part of the healing is when you then recognize, hey, this is being activated again. You're responding to the feeling rather than reacting to the feeling. And that's certainly a sign of the healing that's happening. Yeah. So it's almost like getting to know the wound a little bit rather than just trying to push it to the side and then feeling overwhelmed when it kind of like gets poked at by something.
Okay. And so reacting, would that be an example of, I don't know, like showing anger and then responding? Is that where you're asking what it needs to feel safe or nurtured or loved?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when our wounds get activated, sometimes we do react where we might become angry, and it's okay to feel the emotion of anger, but you might yell at somebody, right? Or you might become defensive, or
Right.
you might come across as judgmental or something
Mm.
along those lines. And that's when we tend to react to it. When we're responding to it, it might even be communicating to be like, yeah, I notice myself feeling angry right now. Let me see what this part of myself needs to feel nurtured and soothed and safe. Mhm.
All right, perfect. I think that's great. I love hearing how I'm supposed to be processing these emotions as they come up, because I feel like I get stuck there and I wasn't really sure what that process was. So I really appreciate you giving me something tangible that I can do to help me through my healing journey, because I think you're right. Sometimes these wounds will get opened again, but it doesn't mean that you failed or anything like that. I think it's a new layer of healing that can be done. And I don't think our healing journey is ever done. And I don't think the goal is to be 100% healed. I think the goal is to just be more mindful and aware and to work on yourself so that you can evolve and grow as you're going through, life.
Absolutely. I fully agree with what you shared. And I think that can, yeah, be this unrealistic expectation, right? Like, I need to be fully healed before X, Y, and Z can happen. And it's really, you're in the state of just like evolving and becoming more aware. And yeah, that's so important to keep in mind. Say along what we were just talking about too, I think a lot of times, yeah, going in to feel, that's what creates the transformation. I think a lot of times it can also be easy to kind of talk about what the emotions are, but then you're coming from a cognitive place rather than a feeling place. And then it can be easy to then repeat that story that you want to be shifting to that's associated with the wound as well. So the inner work process really is the transformation process. And so I just want to emphasize that piece too.
All right. That it's important to feel your emotions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. To look
Allow
inward.
yourself to feel. It is easy to bury them or ignore them. How do you know you felt into that emotion long enough?
I think it can be when you start to maybe feel a little bit of relief. And there might be some times
Oh,
where maybe you don't have time to feel the emotion in the moment, and that's okay. And maybe you can just tell yourself, I'm going to come back to it like later tonight before bed, for example. And I think, yeah, it is just almost this continued process that you end up revisiting. And you might even get to a point where it's like, oh, I feel this emotion coming up. This is good because it's showing me that there's something that's really important for me to be looking at within myself. So let me get curious about this and allow myself to be present. Mm-hmm.
okay. Yeah, I like the idea of being curious. I like the energy of that better than sometimes like the healing, even though I know that's what we're doing, but it feels a little heavier to me, where it's more like curious. It's a different perspective of, what's going on here? And
Yeah,
kind of feels just a little lighter.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think tapping is a good way to explore these other things, because as you're doing that EFT tapping, those different emotions that are associated maybe with that core emotion that you originally started with, that you're examining or looking at or feeling, other things will come up, because I think sometimes our feelings, we might have a feeling, this core feeling of sadness maybe, but there are all these other little parts that contributed to that sadness. So I think EFT is a good way to figure out those other pieces or look at those other pieces.
Absolutely. That's another like really excellent tool. I love EFT myself.
All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to share?
I think the final piece would be just it's important to do just like what works best for you, right? And maybe it is just trying on some of these different techniques. It might be combining some of them. I know that's something that I like to do, but doing something that's where you notice that it's working for you. And I think that's just something I want to
Okay.
emphasize as
All
we
right.
think about going through the process of kinds of like healing some of these core wounds and then connecting more with our authentic selves. But I think that's probably
Okay.
the
Absolutely. I agree with that too. You have to,
good. Mhm. Yeah.
yeah, you have to find what works for you. I think that's important too. So it's my understanding that because you are a licensed therapist or counselor in Illinois, then you can only work with Illinois residents. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. I'm only able to provide clinical psychotherapy services to those who live in Illinois because I'm only licensed to provide services in Illinois.
Okay. And then do you offer any services that people can see you for that are outside of Illinois that doesn't have to do with your counseling business?
I do. The spiritual side of me just really loves card readings and connecting with energy. And so I do offer personal card readings, and I just love kind of like tapping into the unknown and helping be able to see just what some of those subconscious or spiritual messages are to help you feel more empowered and being able to proceed on your soul's journey in a really positive and empowered and self-compassionate way. And so that's something that I offer.
I was just going to say, is this something that you offer in person or virtually?
Right now, I'm just doing it virtually, but I think if someone lived locally, I would certainly be open to doing it in person as well.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I think virtual is great because then you can reach more people all over the world and you aren't just limited to one area. So I think it's always great when somebody offers virtual services.
absolutely. I agree.
Are these services like live over Zoom or are they recorded and you send a recording? How does that work?
I do it a couple different ways. I have an option to do a live reading over Zoom. I have some different options where also I might do just a recorded video reading that I would be able to share with somebody, and I just connect with your energy as I perform the reading. And then I also have another option where I will create a PDF of the cards and a written message to be able to share as well. So it really depends just, I think, like what your interest and need is.
Okay. And where can people find you if they wanted to have a reading with you?
Yeah, so I have a website and it's www.therapyforthesoul.com. And the four is the number four rather than the word four. Mhm.
Okay. Well, we'll absolutely have that link in the show notes for people to have easy access to.
Wonderful.
Is there anything else that you wanted to tell us about your card readings?
I just really love doing them. And I just feel like just my passion
Yeah.
probably comes through and how I do them. And I think I don't like to be in the space where we're trying to predict the future because I always try to emphasize I don't want anybody to feel like they're dependent on a card reading or feeling stuck in this waiting energy. I want those who receive readings from me to
Yeah.
feel empowered and as though they are co creating their life experience with the universe and with the divine. And it's almost like a next step on their journey. And so I just want to emphasize that piece
Okay.
too.
Yeah. Well, I think that's important too because the future really isn't written in stone. It's always changing by your own actions and the actions of those around you, actually. So I don't think you can really predict the future 100%. I don't think any psychic can. And they might have some predictions that come true, but there can always be some variances or some things that change those outcomes.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, that's such an important point.
I also love using oracle cards. I own, I don't know, like 80 decks or something like that. And I just love the imagery on oracle cards.
Mhm.
I really connect with the visual of the oracle cards. I feel like it works with my third eye and intuition because I see the images on the cards and I pick up different information from the cards based on what that image is, not just the words that are on the card, but also, like I said, really that imagery plays a huge part in how I get messages from spirit.
Yeah. And I think there's such like an awesome tool with all the different ways to be like, yeah, receiving those messages and interpreting those messages and sharing them.
Thank you for watching part 2 of my interview with Carolyn. We had such a great conversation both times, and I really appreciated her being on my show. She had so much great, helpful information to offer all of you, and you can find all of her links in the show notes if you'd like to reach out and work with her, whether it's to get an oracle reading or to become a client of hers in her counseling practice, but you would have to be an Illinois resident in order to do that. But with her readings, you can be anywhere in the world and work with her. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you in my next podcast. Bye. Thank you for joining me in today's episode. Be sure to check the show notes for guest links and other helpful information. I'm your host, Olivia Paige, and you can find me on all the social media platforms at Ascension Healing Sounds.